Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul and Strategy, and I'm Tosca. Not all nonprofits and civil society organizations survive. In fact, a good proportion, research would indicate, eventually closes down. The early years are often fraught with the risk of having to close down, but it can also definitely happen later. Yet we don't talk much about that. There are some examples that have been well documented, especially in the last 5 to 8 years, but it remains a bit of a topic that, to my mind, seems to have some taboo status around it, and that needs to change. In 2024, I was able to reconnect with a leader who had attended one of the senior leadership development programs that I used to direct at some point in my past, and her name is Amy Miller-Taylor. Amy has a special story to tell about how she found herself confronted with having to close down an organization not that long after she had joined in as new ED, as executive director. We need more discussion about what it takes to lead and manage through an organizational close down. So I'm really grateful, Amy, that you are here to tell us about it. Welcome.
Thank you, Tosca. It's so nice to be reconnected a decade later, and on a different continent.
On a new continent, and at what time, but we won't go into that. So, dear listeners, let me just briefly introduce you to Amy's bio. A couple of highlights only. She is the Deputy Chief of Party of a program called Power by the People by the organization Partners Global. She's the former Executive Director of Global Integrity, and we're going to talk about that. She was for at least 12 years at Civicus, which is a really important global network of civil society organizations across, really, truly across the world, and where she was, amongst others, the head of resource mobilization and partnership director. And she's had other roles as well before that, but I wanted to focus on these. Okay, Amy, tell us first about what Global Integrity was. What was the nature of the organization or the network that it was? What was its mission? And tell us something also, just give us a flavor about the size and scope.
Well, Global Integrity was a small and very agile organization working to ensure that public resources were really meeting the needs of citizens. So they were tackling challenges related to corruption and public service delivery, and really working with a network of governance reformers around the world to try to make sure that those resources were really addressing people's needs.
I see. And just tell us a little bit, just how many people worked there, and a little bit about its revenue.
Right. So when I joined Partners Global, we had a team, small and mighty, of around 10 colleagues who were working both in programs and operations. Some had very specialist skill sets in terms of transparency, accountability, participatory governance methodologies. Others were really focused on adaptive learning and program management. We had kind of researchers who were looking to use local evidence generation to influence global policy and programming. So it was a very specialist team who I think was very well recognized and well regarded in the open governance space.
Open governance space, because that was the space you worked in. And you just said in Partners Global, but I think you meant in Global Integrity. Correct? Yeah, I just want to make
Thank
sure.
you. Yes,
You're
Global Integrity.
welcome, of course, so that our listeners can track what we are discussing. So you were basically a small, agile network, if you will, that had an organization that wanted to connect local open governance activists and researchers to global ones, and vice versa, the local global, right?
And in addition to the kind of bridging role that we played between local and global governance reform processes, we were also the co-founder, along with Development Gateway, which is now an IREX venture, of the Open Gov Hub, which is, if you haven't come across it, in
I
Washington,
have.
D.C., this really vibrant, open works in event space for various governance reform organizations. So it was really a convening and collaboration hub. And so Global Integrity played that work in terms of our local programming and footprint, as well as with peers here in Washington, D.C.
Where you are now based as of very recent times. Yeah. So you joined as a new executive director, and within 1 year, do I recall that correctly? You had to oversee its closure. Is that correct? It was not that long after you joined?
So I joined in March, and by December we had closed.
That is a very short runway indeed. Yeah. So what, in a nutshell, and within what you can talk about, of course, what happened? What had been the run up to the conclusion that the organization had to close? Why did you have to close?
It was a matter of not having sufficient funding, and I knew joining Global Integrity that we had a runway secured through the end of the year, and we had that amount of time to come up with a new strategy, a new business model, and a different way of working that would allow us to be more sustainable and more impactful in the sector.
Mm, yeah. And so my understanding also, you provided me with one or two background articles, right? So my understanding is that you explore different um, modalities, if you will, different roles, right? And eventually you decided that there simply was not a runway. But already in our preparatory conversation, I was struck by, and also by your notes, is how you did feel very supported and that it was a collective decision. I'd like this conversation to focus on the kind of managerial, maybe not the nuts and bolts, maybe not at that level, but definitely the kind of the tangible things that you as a leader, with those who were with you in this, and you speak about your partners quite a bit, that collaboration committee, for instance, the steps you had to go through to get to a responsible ending. So if we could go there, I imagine it takes a lot of steps and a lot of due diligence as well. That sounds very boring, but it's actually very important in this case, right? Yeah. Could you unpack for us these elements of what this involved? And then I'll be asking you a little bit about some elements like people aspects and a few other things.
Oh. Well, I think firstly, just to say that it wasn't that we hadn't explored every possible pathway to viability, right? Like we really, I think, embraced the idea that we needed to transform, that business as usual was not working. And we looked at some radically different models for how we might be able to continue to contribute to the open governance space in meaningful ways. So we looked at our role as a broker of relationships and how we could bring together partners and funders in more meaningful ways. We looked at how we could monetize products and franchise different income generating activities. We looked at reorganizing into a kind of co-op with our network of governance reformers. And then eventually, after lots of conversation and listening and learning from our partners, we decided to pursue our kind of bridging role and bridging actors across geographies and sectors and issues, because that's what our constituents said that they valued most.
I see.
Again, maybe in retrospect, one of the more radical models of transformation might have been better fit for purpose, but I think the value of undertaking that exercise and really exploring the possibilities and limitations of lots of completely different ways of doing our work and contributing to our mission was
Yeah.
valuable in and of itself. And I think it also helped to land the realization that we could not continue operating the same way and remain viable, which of course, different people internalize this at different points and in different ways. And I think that was also an important step that we needed to go through so that we could move forward together with more difficult conversations around how we wanted to try to safeguard the future of the organization.
Yeah, and maybe also safeguard the legacy of the organization,
Mm.
right? It's something that I think is really important, and I want to talk more with you about. Let's talk about a couple of people aspects. And by the way, I was really struck in your accompanying note to me when you said we needed to ensure that our decisions prioritize the interest of the movement that you were a part of, the open governance movement, over self-preservation.
Mm.
And I think that's a really critical point because it's my opinion that I see a lot of kind of hidden self-preservation motives um, automatically jump up, if you will, rather, but that we're not totally always candid about that. And rather than saying in whose interest do we continue this and how long and how hard do we try to continue this, right? And so I really was struck by that. Do you want to talk actually a little bit about that before we get to the people aspect?
Yes. I do think it's not that we didn't really go all in with
Yeah.
that donor outreach, and especially private funders who had traditionally been our primary income source. But I think when it was obvious that those relationships weren't going to meet our immediate needs, we pivoted to engaging with our peers and other strategic partners to see where we could explore collaborations with groups that we were mission and values aligned
Mm.
that would allow us to be collectively more impactful by really leveraging our respective assets and networks. And then also the administrative consolidations with peer organizations that reduced our operational costs. And that's what allowed us to have a responsible closure. It was the support we garnered from our peers. So I would just wanted to put that out there. But personally, my greatest source of support throughout this period, when we were considering and eventually implementing global integrity's closure, was my peer leaders. So at the very generous suggestion of peers at the Open Gov Hub, we created a collaboration committee that met weekly. And these leaders of other organizations gave their time to me every week.
Yeah.
And not only for emotional support, but I mean, these are great thinkers and great strategizers, and they were providing advice and really helping to explore options or limitations that I hadn't fully considered. And together, we really did chart a path forward in terms of how global integrity might be able to maintain its sustainability. But as you were saying, for me, the most important part of that effort together was that they were also that accountability check, so that if it wasn't really in the interest of the sector, they were going to call that out, and we were going to be able to move forward knowing that we were moving forward because that's what our peers and our colleagues felt like we needed to do for the ecosystem.
That's
And
remarkable.
that also gives you a sense of confidence in navigating these times that was really invaluable. Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite remarkable. That
Mm.
whole story of this committee of people from other organizations who accompanied you and your colleagues through this, providing both support, but also holding the organizational and its decisions accountable in terms of what's in the interest of the mission and what the causes that you all cared for and care for. Um, let's talk about some of the aspects of the people. So your colleagues, small organization, but that doesn't matter for this purpose, right? People understand messages about significant and dramatic organizational change like this, right? And there was obviously some inherently threatening elements to that for everybody, right? Yeah. People need to hear messaging around that in different ways and through different channels. I could fill it in more, but I'd love to hear you talk about that, whether that resonates, how you dealt with communication.
Um, well, and I think communication with all of our different constituents and stakeholders, right? Because we had a small team, and for our team of 10 to really understand and align on how we wanted to respond to this situation, that took time. Because we all had different levels of information and understanding, and we needed to have those conversations together. We needed to put them in writing and questions and answers. We needed to discuss them in a personal way, in individual conversations. And then we also needed to open up safe spaces for people to provide anonymous feedback where they might not feel comfortable otherwise. And so from a team perspective, there was a lot of effort that went into making sure that we were going to be moving together as we articulated and implemented our response. And it was perhaps one of a controversial decision in terms of we shared this with the team in real time. And as soon as we realized exactly what our runway was, the team had that information, and were told that we would be supporting them in their endeavors to decide how best to safeguard their own personal well-being and their livelihoods and what they needed to do for their families. And of
Yeah.
course, we were warned about staff retention and the dangers thereof. But I think in line with the organization's commitments to transparency and
Yeah.
inclusion and accountability, it was the only decision.
Was
So there was very open communication from the very beginning with colleagues, but we also informed all of our funders immediately. And that was really important in terms of we were kind of scenario planning from very early days with our funders. And then we brought in our strategic partners who were implementing programs as well. And we provided everybody with weekly updates on exactly where we were in terms of what our targets were, our progress, our possibilities, the actions that we were taking. And so they had the information, they had full sight on how we were responding, and we were able to work together again to determine the best way forward for our programs and activities, and not only for global integrity. And I think because of that very early and open communication, again, our partners, including our donors, responded in the most kind of humane and gracious way, and were allies to the end. Were cheering for us. Were really with us, it felt like, to the end, and even afterwards, calling in and checking in and making sure. And that also, because we were open with all of our stakeholders, it allowed us to be really proactive in terms of also looking for opportunities for our team and our colleagues. So we were looking at we promoted our team directly through the network.
You mean for future
For future roles, we said, this is what's happening. We want to safeguard not only our kind of tools and resources and assets, but also these incredible colleagues and experts in the open governance space who can continue to contribute in different roles and in different organizations. And so that was also a really important part of having everybody on the same page, and not only our teams, but really the grants, the assets, the partnerships. We were able to look, kind of seed those in other ways.
Others, so to hand them over, if you will. I was going to ask you about that, but just to say that, yeah, so you emphasized amongst others that it's important that the people who needed to depart the organization, and by the way, that was you also, right? It included you, but needed to be able to depart with dignity and with support, etc., for job search, networking, recommendation, etc. Back to the communication for a moment, without going into specifics, more in general, did you ever have to temporarily not disclose important information because you didn't know yet how it would work out? There were some really important unknowns, for instance, where you say, I can't be as transparent about this on this moment until a later point in time. And also just simply about not knowing, right? When people want to know what's going to happen, and when you didn't know, how did you deal with that as a leader?
Yes. Well, I think, I mean, for me, one of the most empowering realizations is that you don't have to wait around to have all of the information to make decisions and to communicate with your stakeholders. You have to communicate clearly about what you know, what you don't know, what you're doing, and what you cannot do. But I think for me, not feeling like you need to have perfect clarity in terms of what's possible meant that we were really able to kind of share throughout. There were instances where we could not share who the next which organization or entity was going to take over a particular grant or program, because the donor had their own due diligence processes. But we were able to say, we've recommended these two organizations for consideration as part of the due diligence process. And as soon as a determination has been made, we will let you know who will be taking this program forward. So I think we erred on the side of over communicating, even when we couldn't give perfect or complete answers.
Okay, you just said exactly based on, as you know, I have not gone through your experience, but I have researched in the form of one particular case study that it has some similarity to what you went through as an organization. I'll reference some of the findings from that in a moment, but and I have talked to many leaders, and what you just said about communication was exactly what I say when I advise leaders about that. What was a crucial lesson, Amy, that you learned about the financial part of due diligence? So for instance, Global Integrity was still running programs, right? So how to land the financial management for that and the handover, et cetera, in a way where it all comes in on time, if you will. How to continue to also deliver programs while already being a wind down.
I think because Global Integrity had practice in handing over programs to local leaders and partners, it meant that we already had some protocol around how to do this in a responsible way. We had handed over programs like the African Integrity Indicators to our program partners in Kenya, the African Institute for Development Policy. We'd handed other programs over to Public Service Accountability Monitor in South Africa. So there was a kind of practice in place that we were able to adopt and lean on that really kind of facilitated this. It also allowed us to communicate confidence to our donors in our ability to hand over to local partners in a responsible way. And I think being able to kind of highlight these successful examples of previous programs and contracts meant that we were able to do that program wind down quite efficiently using our program teams and colleagues, which also freed up the senior leadership team to really focus on both the kind of the legacy piece and the consolidation of learning and tools and resources and partnerships, as well as the kind of administrative aspects of winding down, which are a story in and of itself. But because we were able to really kind of distribute the ownership for the wind down process, it allowed us to do it relatively quickly.
I was gonna say.
Over a 3-month period, really, from the decision that the board took to dissolve to when we closed operations. It was a 3-month period, and we were only able to do that because we were aware that there was a possibility that we would be closing and had really ensured that everybody was ready to quickly pivot into a wind down process, including our team, our partners, our funders. And because we really own this as a team. And there was some incredible, I think, examples of feminist distributed leadership in play during this process.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Can you give us some sense of the, without going into lots of nuts and bolts, but the administrative parts? Like, what are the big building blocks there? What are the big things that need to be accomplished that we might not think of?
I think I've blocked it out, Tosca.
Okay.
It wasn't my favorite part of the wind down. No, but of course we had some, again, some support in that we were able to seek a collaboration grant, and which we received, that allowed us to support a lot of the accounting and financial work that would allow us to close out the organization, and especially related to the complexities of co-operating the OpenGov Hub. There were, of course, the lease and those kinds of legalities. There was making sure that we were managing from a human resource perspective, ensuring that every colleague had employment letters that they could use going forward, that they had references on record, that there were all of the kind of tax and payroll kinds of considerations. And we also made sure that we closed with the understanding that we wanted to be able to have some kind of severance as a recognition of the contribution that colleagues had made to the organization, even though it didn't come close to what they deserved. But so there was a constant kind of financial juggling to try to make sure that we were moving quickly enough that we could also not only meet our compliance and our legal obligations, but also try to do something more for the people and the partners that really were global integrity. So there was definitely some financial gymnastics that our director of finance and ops really handled with incredible grace.
Grace was the word that came to my mind as well. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to tell us about the legacy preservation? So you talked about the the resources, the tools, the assets, that the program handover we talked about, but that how to make sure that the total contribution of global integrity to society was preserved in some way, either handed over by others or accessible for those who might benefit from that.
Yes. I mean, really, as a first-time executive director, closing an organization is a serious blow to your ego. I would have preferred to crawl under a rock and hide during that period. But of course, our team members and our partners had a right to be proud in what they had accomplished and contributed, and to celebrate that, and to celebrate it loudly and proudly. And that's what we did. So we launched, instead of sending out a sad message on LinkedIn, we launched a Learning with Integrity digital campaign in which we really tried to consolidate and share our learnings over this incredible history. We compiled the resources and made sure that those were accessible and available. And we also suggested other relevant organizations and connections in the field to continue the work that we thought was the most promising. So that was, I think, it felt good. It felt good to end on that note. And we also, of course, did the less visible work of engaging with our IT provider to ensure that our digital assets were preserved and safeguarded. We utilized Candid's Issue Lab, where we have stored all of our reports and resources and methodologies, and those can still be accessed. So we really put a significant effort to the legacy piece, and we felt like we owed that to the organization and the sector.
Yeah, of course. I was going to ask you how this ultimately felt for you psychologically, but you've already responded to that, and I can so imagine that. I want to hear you talk a little bit more before we get towards the end, and that is so the importance of rituals and celebrations. Some organizations, again, there's not a whole lot of documentation of organizations that close down or die, if you will, but they have explicit funerals for their organization. You talked about ending loud and proud through the digital campaign and so on. Anything more you want to say about the importance of rituals, storytelling, and so on to end well?
I think in a lot of ways, it wasn't only my story to tell, right? I had been part of this journey for a blink of an eye, right?
Or a very yeah.
And for me, I had the previous executive directors, the founding executive director, the boards of director,
Yeah.
partners over the years. For me, it was really important to see how they told their stories of global integrity. Again, we shared with them early days exactly what was happening and leaned on them for their advice and their experience, really understanding what was the vision of the Open Gov Hub, really understanding what was the vision for this and trying to ensure that we were really building on the work of those who came before us. And in the closing days and months, seeing those voices tell that story and also celebrate
Yeah.
the contribution to the space was no one, not one person said, Amy, you really screwed this up. Right? Like instead it really did feel like those stories, there were really heartwarming memories. There were um a kind of sharing of personal struggles over the years. And it felt like a journey that you could kind of accompany and appreciate and um, and end together. And I
Yeah.
think really that idea of ending well and making sure that you have the time and the headspace and the energy to end well is so
Yeah.
important because in ending well, then you're creating the possibilities for new beginnings. And that's what it felt like.
Yeah, so, so important. I'm so glad I asked the question. Um, I actually had one more question before we get to the end, and it's a short one. In your experience, and no, this is not about you as an individual leader, but if you look back at the whole lifespan of global integrity and what you said, the earlier boards, the founders, the people who came before you, the partners, the peers, and the staff, right? Was the closing of global integrity a case of dying well or dying badly? Maybe it's a rhetorical question. You know, this is term dying well, dying badly comes from my colleague Barney Talek, and it's often used in recent years more around the significant financial pressures across the sector with the funding landscape, the severe funding landscape changes in traditional fundraising markets, at least, right? Was the close a case of dying well or dying badly in the way you look back upon it?
This is a loaded question because, of course, I'm only speaking personally.
Yeah,
And personally, I'm proud of what we managed to do and
that's what I'm sensing.
how we managed to end. I think in a worst case scenario, it was the best possible outcome. And so I do feel proud. That doesn't mean I don't um I don't still carry sadness for
Mm.
the partnerships, for the people, for the possibility of what might have been if we had continued that journey.
Yeah, the two coexist, in other words.
Mm.
As is so often the case, right? Polarities that in life that are true at the same time. But I sensed throughout this conversation that this is a case, and in a remarkably short timeline, as you said, of dying well. And I find it in a way encouraging, and there's a certain sense of yeah, that if the end is good and it's done in the right way, and the way global integrity has done that, that is a good thing, right? Even if the alternative would have been also good, but in a different way. Does that make sense or not?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I really do. Well, Amy, this was an intense conversation. Where should people go if they want to learn more about that important legacy of global integrity that so many people and activists have contributed to? And where should they go to find out more about you and what you're up to now?
Mm. Well, for global integrity, the best source of information right now is the repository on Candid's Issue Lab. You just search global integrity, and you'll see that piece, including the Learning with Integrity, which is the kind of cumulative report that was produced. And then personally, Amy Miller Taylor on LinkedIn. And of course,
LinkedIn.
I have to say the people I'd never met prior to this rather public closing of global integrity, but who had also been involved in sunsetting organizations, who reached out to provide support and solidarity, was incredible. And so if anyone else, and I think especially right now in this moment, there's a lot of us who are looking at strategic sunsettings and closing, and how we can do that well, not only for our organizations, but for our partners and our teams. I might not have great advice, but I definitely would be here to listen and support you however I can.
Wow, that's a beautiful offer. And you do speak from experience. I think you have a lot of valuable experience to offer. And I know you to be a terrific leader. You have so much integrity yourself, Amy. So I'm really grateful that you came on the show today. Thank you for all the insights that gave us so much food for thought about an important and often, I think, under appreciated topic. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, there are others on the podcast, as well as some provocative blog posts on my website, fiveoaksconsulting.org, as well as the YouTube channel. I do want to give a shout out before we finish to another podcast well worth your time if you work in international development and want to enhance your leadership skills, and that is the Modern Humanitarian and Development Leader with Tori Peace as a host. Tori is a seasoned international development practitioner and leadership coach, and she offers you in her podcast practical tips to empower diverse teams, take control of your time, and achieve more while doing less. So you'll find more information about Tori's podcast in the show notes. And with that, I am saying goodbye, and I will see you next time at NGO Soul and Strategy.